The first sound was a clink of crystal on crystal, a small, defiantly bright noise in the hush of first class. A woman in a tailored jacket lifted a glass of wine as if making a toast to her own importance. Around her, the cabin hummed with the quiet rituals of privileged travel. Soft laughter, the rustle of a newspaper unfolded just so, a designer handbag positioned with the precision of a second identity. Sophie's drawing lay on her lap, a sun with too many rays, a little cockpit sketched in crayon, and two stick figures, one with a tiny badge on his chest and the other with a braid. Her lip trembled. Ethan sat next to her, a hand across the small of her back. He had already smoothed the corner of the paper once. Now he smoothed it again, like straightening a coat that had been ruffled. Isabella Lane raised her glass louder than necessary. "Oh, come on," she said, and the words cut like a polished blade. "This is first class. This is for people who can afford to be comfortable. I don't know why the attendants let you sit here." Her voice had the practiced edge of someone used to making public corrections. Around them, polite laughter bloomed. The businessman in 3A glanced up from his tablet and leaned back, amused. A couple in the row behind exchanged a look and whispered. The flight attendant, Janet, was on autopilot for rules. She checked tickets, she repeated policies, and she moved forward with an apology that had none of the warmth of a true one. Sophie's tear tracked a single bright line down her cheek. She didn't cry loudly. She did what children sometimes did when the world was larger than their place in it. She made small things persist. She held up her paper as if holding a shield. Ethan looked down at the drawing, then at his daughter, then at the woman with the raised glass. He wore a sweater that said nothing, and a face that said even less. A badge slid against his ribcage that afternoon, an old silver wing tucked in a jacket pocket. He did not pull it out. He reached instead for the small laminated card Sophie liked to carry, a faded photograph of a jet, a name scrawled in ink, a line about Daddy flew fast planes. Sophie whispered, "Look, Daddy, it's us," her voice fragile with the hope that pictures sometimes carried. The laughter continued. It was not cruel at first. It was social lubrication. But it gathered momentum. A whisper became a chuckle became a chorus. Entitlement has a way of recruiting others as proof. Isabella's eyes narrowed at Sophie's drawing, then at Uzan. "It's just cute," she said, and there was a delicious cruelty in that one-word dismissal. "But this is a grown-up cabin." Ethan's jaw tightened once, not in anger but in calculation. He did not want the scene. He tightened the strap across Sophie's seatbelt with the careful hands of someone who knew what fastening could mean. Around them, the cabin kept its polished surfaces.
Somewhere near the galley, Janet's shoes squeaked as she repeated the ticket line and the policy once more. Etiquette served as an ally to insult. Sophie sniffed. In her mind, she drew a little oval around the sun and pressed harder. The pencil bit the paper deeper. "Daddy," she said, small and stoic, "why do they think we don't belong?" Ethan bent to her, voice low. He kept it simple, because truth, uncluttered by justification, was the only thing a child needed right then. "People forget what they don't see every day," he said, "but drawings don't lie." Later, a camera would catch, if there had been a camera, the way Isabella's hand trembled when the wine sloshed at the rim. At the time, it was only a small spill, a spray onto the tray and the fabric beneath. A man in the row across lifted a napkin with a practiced air. "Some people get used to getting everything without thinking," he said to his companion, as if making a point of observation, not responsibility. The plane left the gate with the quiet bureaucratic grace of a massive machine doing its thing, wheels retracting, engines settling into a steady chant. Through the small oval of the window, the city shrunk into a smudge and then a lattice of lights. Sophie pressed her nose to the glass, drawing a small fog with her breath. Ethan had not been a public man for a long time. He was a major in the United States Air Force once, a fact he did not wear like armor anymore, but the shape of it remained. He'd flown F-16s, logged about 2,000 flight hours, and then had traded flight suits for the quieter life of an aviation engineer and consultant. He believed in checks and in quiet competence more than in stories. He believed fiercely in Sophie. Those were the two things his life kept near. You might have seen him at breakfast, alone at day's beginning. He made pancakes with the stubborn, precise rhythm of someone who had been trained in routines where a missed beat could mean everything. Sophie would hum at the sink while she colored with the intensity of a small person making a big world. He would tuck a paper into his pocket, a note about a brief, a schedule, a dentist appointment, little things that mapped a day into a life. That morning, he had chosen this seat because it had more space for her backpack full of crayons. He had chosen this flight because it was direct. He had chosen to keep quiet when Isabella's words came, because sometimes a parent's job is to shelter the child from the fight, not to begin one. The cabin's social dryness began to crack at the edges as pockets of unease shifted. A murmured shh from someone who saw a child's lip quiver. A baby near the back, suddenly awake, wailing at the emotional dissonance. But for all the noise, the humiliation fed itself like a small fire against dry kindling. It was loud enough to hurt and small enough to excuse. Then the plane trembled. It started as a shudder, a tremor that ran through the fuselage like a hand across a piano string.
The lights flicked, and someone laughed nervously, then stopped. A sound, metal, strained, rose and fell like a distant mood. Drinks bristled on trays. Overhead bins clicked. A woman's heels tapped once, twice, then still. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, calm, professional, the voice of an occupation that had to make others feel safe, even when it could not know everything. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking. We are experiencing a systems issue. Please remain seated. Flight attendants, take your stations. The attendant Janet moved with the efficient kindness of someone who had practiced hospitality and rules in equal measure. She walked down the aisle, smoothing a blanket here, checking a tray there. The plane shuddered again. Somewhere a child behind them cried. Sophie's fingers clutched the edge of her drawing. Then the lights dimmed low and the screens flickered. The hum of conversation dwindled into a collective intake of breath. A few murmurs, then the pause of people waiting for an explanation. The airplane, in that suspended moment, felt suddenly like a small island in a noisy sea. Captain Rodriguez's voice returned, tighter now. We are experiencing indications of hydraulic anomalies. We are bringing the aircraft to a lower altitude for diagnosis. Please remain calm. Hydraulics. It was a word that had little meaning for most passengers, until it became everything. The autopilot clicked back and forth. The plane's systems were designed to cope, to alert and to summon lists of procedures. But hydraulics handled the heavy lifting, the physical part of the machine that obeyed the pilot's hand. When hydraulics were compromised, control became a more tactile, demanding thing. Something else happened then. The hum of ridicule, the earlier crackle, fell abruptly quiet. Seats straightened. The elitist volume dropped. In the span of seconds, the airflow of social theater gave way to a different current, a pragmatic, almost ancestral call for skill. Captain Rodriguez sounded over the speakers, his voice a professional blend of urgency and clarity. We may need a volunteer with experience in high-performance aircraft to assist with manual control awareness, he said. If there is a fighter pilot on board, please identify yourself to a flight attendant. For a heartbeat, the cabin held its breath. The laughter, the cheap applause, the small humiliations, they all flared and then diminished, like embers suffocated by sudden rain. The phrase landed between the rows and made the air electrically different. Fighter pilot. It carried the weight of something heroic and practical in one breath. It shifted the geometry of the room. Suddenly, credentials mattered in a way they hadn't a few minutes before. Sophie looked up first. Her eyes were wide, brightened with a child's particular brand of hope that big movies had taught her about, the parent who would rise and save the day. "Daddy," she said, soft and expectant.
Ethan's hand went to his chest. The silver wing touched his palm. He felt its cool weight, the way a man might feel a single decision pressing at the base of his throat. He had not intended to reveal himself. He had plans, conversations he would have about entitlement later, private lectures he would give to distant strangers in the form of silence. But the world had a way of asking for what people refused to offer. He reached for his badge, the old insignia worn from years of fastening and unfastening. He thought of noise, the noise of laughter at their expense, and the more inward noise that had driven him from uniforms to contracts, from dogfights to deadlines. He thought of Sophie's small hand in his, and the way her drawings had mapped his identity back to him. He thought of the particular clarity that comes when everything that matters is physical and immediate and requires skill. "Sir," Janet said, tapping lightly at his shoulder, her voice a whisper that was part formality, part plea. He rose when he had to. He did not stand like a man who had to be seen. He stood like a man responding to a call. The movement was small. Heads turned. The wineglass trembled at Isabella's fingers. When he passed, someone murmured, "Isn't that?" and then didn't finish. People fill silences with speculation. When confirmation is present, the speculations die. He reached the galley and then the cockpit door. Sophie's view of it was clear and simple. She imagined her father with a cape, not because he needed one, but because she had drawn him that way once. She pressed her hands to her knees and whispered, "Go, Daddy." Children believe in direct action the way they believe in the sun rising. Ethan did not don a cape.
He pinned the silver wings to his sweater, with the quick, efficient motion of someone who had attached many things under pressure. The wings caught the cabin light and threw it like a promise. He met Janet's eyes. For a brief second, they shared a look that held more than words. Trust tempered by limits. He ducked into the cockpit. The smell there was an immediate, intimate thing. Ozone and metal, and the faint peppermint of systems that had been kept in working order by human hands. Captain Rodriguez turned from the array of screens, his jaw tight with the professional equivalent of prayer. Procedures run through the mind at speeds that approximated fingers on a piano. He did not look surprised to see a uniformed man at the threshold. Aviation is a world of small overlaps in timing. "Major Ward?" the captain said, reading a name or perhaps verifying hope. Ethan nodded. "Yes, Captain. I'm here to help." In the cabin, the change was a physical thing. Laughter evolved into a hush so dense you could hear breath. Isabella's face went white, her entitlement knocked into the hard wall of reality. The businessman in 3A straightened and opened his mouth, which closed again like a window.
People shifted in their seats, suddenly smaller in their own chests. Inside the cockpit, the air moved faster. Screens glowed with fault codes. A hydraulic pressure gauge read low and whispered warnings. The autopilot had dropped out. The aircraft felt immediately like an instrument in a musician's lap. It could be coaxed, driven, and placated, or it could become an instrument of chaos if kept in ignorance. Ethan slid into a seat like a man slipping into a familiar skin. He let some old instinct come forward, the way a pilot learns to read a machine as a conversation partner rather than as an object. He ran the checks with his hands, calm and assured. His fingers moved with a memory that did not belong to this seat. F-16s had different consoles, different rhythms, but the logic of flying was the same. Respect the forces, don't guess, solve step by step. A memory touched him then, unbidden and warm with adrenaline. A sunrise over a runway, the smell of jet fuel, the crack and roar as the engine woke. Not an operational debrief full of claims, but the sensory ghost of a life where each instrument voice was a part of his own heartbeat. It was enough to steady him. "Hydraulics are bleeding down," Ethan said. His voice had the frankness of someone lending experience, not claiming drama. "If we lose primary hydraulic pressure, we'll have to fly the control surfaces manually. The big trick is to keep the airspeed and give the pilots feedback on trim." Captain Rodriguez nodded. "We've isolated the leak. The systems are degraded. I'll fly what I can, but I'll need someone who's handled manual recovery under high workload." Ethan's hands took the yoke. The plane reacted. It was at once a relief and an intensification. He told the captain what he needed: flaps, airspeed margins, a shallow bank, and the captain responded. The aircraft, that grand machine, listened to a collaboration between men in a small cabin and an engine that still wanted to obey. In the cabin, barely audible at first, the noise rose and fell with the plane's mood, the metallic groan, the soft thud of passengers being asked to brace, the rattle of oxygen masks deploying in the overhead. People's faces were lit by the screens. Sophie gripped her father's sweater from the outside, fingers white on fabric. Ethan's voice was measured but quick now. He spoke in verbs and numbers and plain terms. "Trim left 2 degrees, add 5 knots, hand me the manual trim handle." He took one control, then another. He spoke to the plane like someone speaking to an animal he knew. He monitored the gauges, watched the hydraulic reservoir trickle, and kept his hands steady. He gave instructions to the flight crew, to the captain, to the attendants, in a tone that mixed command with the visible relief for someone who had been called to something he was born to do. Back in first class, Isabella watched the man who had been a figure in her private theater become a person in a public one.
Her hands were in her lap, the wine glass she had raised emptied, half forgotten. She felt the heat of public attention now on herself, the kind that first welcomes and then isolates. It stung. For the first time in a long time, she noticed the absence of reflexes that protected her from accountability, the practiced laugh, the dismissive hand. There was no script here that could absolve her. The plane dipped once, and the cabin breathed as one. The seatbelt signs flashed like small, urgent red moons. A mother near the back murmured prayers into her palm. The businessman in 3A had his head bowed, as if listening to instructions in a church of humans who had no bait for scorn. "Captain," Ethan said finally, hearing the thing that needed hearing, "we'll bring her in on manual. I can help manage the controls and the trim. We'll need to set up for an overweight, high-speed landing if the hydraulics don't regain. Best case, we'll conserve what we can and touch down with the gear extended, manual extension if we have to." Captain Rodriguez's eyes were a map of trust. "I'll run checklists and brief the cabin for an emergency landing," he said. "I'll need your assistance with control input and with the system's cross-checks." They became a crew. The captain's voice changed.
no longer an uncertain announcer, but an element in a professional choreography. Flight attendants, prepare cabin for possible emergency. Passengers, please remain seated and secure. We will be landing at the nearest airport. Janet did what she had always done. She turned competence into compassion. She moved through the cabin, tightening belts with a soft hand, checking that oxygen masks were in reach, folding a small hoodie over Sophie's knees like a mother who had gone into service. The rules that had been a wedge a few minutes before were now lifelines. Sophie watched her father through small, wide eyes. She had watched many routines in her life, bedtime rituals, the way he fixed a bicycle chain, the way he sometimes hummed under his breath when he thought she was asleep. But this was new. This was him moving with a certain kind of authority that didn't need to speak to her to reassure her. It was enough to see the silver wings pinned near his heart. She drew him in a new picture later, him at a window, hands on a wheel, and a tiny plane landing beneath a smiling sun. The descent was a study in slow, exacting pain. The aircraft sighed as it traded altitude for speed. It was not the dramatic vertigo of a movie. It was an expert's negotiation with gravity. The control surfaces required more effort. Ethan and Captain Rodriguez monitored fuel flow, flap settings, and the manual extension mechanisms. Every procedure was a promise to the people inside. In the cabin, the earlier taunts had become a different sound, an awkward rustle of regrets forming into apologies. A woman whose pearls had been tight around her throat whispered to a friend, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have laughed."
A man wiped his eyes, not necessarily from fear, but from the shock of seeing a life reduced to its essentials and then restored by another's skill. A chorus of small human noises, inhalations, soft sobs, the clink of a rosary bead perhaps, or a simple hand over a mouth. Isabella sat rigid for a long while. Her face was a map of lines she had drawn on herself to survive in boardrooms and power lunches. Now those lines seemed less useful. She watched Ethan's hands, the way his fingers adjusted a dial, the way he and the captain conferred with quick professional language. She felt something new and rough in her throat, remorse, or perhaps the prelude to it. When the wheels kissed the runway, it felt like a release. The cabin erupted into applause, first as disbelief and then as gratitude. Some people clapped with tremulous hands, others cried. Sophie began to clap too, the clapping of a child who understands heroism as a simple, unfoldable thing. Ethan let out a breath that had been waiting at the bottom of him for the whole flight. His hand found Sophie's in the darkened cabin and squeezed. People stood slowly, the motion of ordinary muscles after extraordinary stress. Passengers moved forward, one by one, toward the cockpit like pilgrims. The businessman from 3A was first, his face etched in a way that suggested he had been thinking of more than an apology. He had been thinking of drawers to open in himself that he had avoided. He said something hurried, earnest, tripping on words that had not been practiced for humility. "Major Ward," he said, I shouldn't have. I was wrong." Others crowded with one-liners of thanks. A young mother pressed a folded paper into Ethan's hand, a small note that read, "Thank you." A little boy offered a chocolate bar. Each small gift was a simple currency, human recognition exchanged for service rendered. Isabella approached last. Her gait had been composed for boardrooms, not for confession. She stopped a foot away from Ethan. There was a moment in which she measured his face as if measuring the depth of a wound she had started. She did not reach for her old tools. There was a smallness in her posture that suggested a window had opened where a door had stood. "Major Ward," she said, and her voice trembled not with faintness but with the beginning of something like clarity. "I am so sorry. I was cruel. I had no right. Toward you or toward your daughter. There's no excuse." It was not a grand absolution. It was a specific, accountable apology. She named the offense with the plainness she would later use in memos and press releases. She met Ethan's eyes, and for the first time she saw not an object to be judged, but a person who had given himself to save what mattered to her too. Life, safety, dignity. Ethan accepted it, but gently. He had intricate reasons for how he had handled the humiliation. It had been a parent's calculus, to protect Sophie, to preserve an example.
He thought of the child's questions about belonging, and had chosen to answer with action rather than with spectacle. "I forgive you," he said finally, and his voice did not ring with triumph. It carried only the quiet of someone who had weathered a storm. "Not because it was easy, but because my daughter needs to know how dignity looks when it's being tested." Isabella's eyes filled. The rest of the cabin might have been watching the performance of remorse, but for her it was a private reckoning. She took a breath, and the sound of it was small but real. A day or two later, when the formalities have been observed and the news cycle had done what news cycles do, Isabella called Ethan, She found a way to be businesslike and human at once. "I represent a company that needs better safety culture," she said. "I was an idiot in the moment, and I want to try to make it right. Would you consider meeting about a consultant role?" The offer was plausible. She had a company that prided itself on efficiency and image. It was not unlikely she would reach for her resources to repair what she had damaged and to avoid future embarrassments. The offer smelled of real practical restitution and the shrewdness of someone who intended to make an institution safer while also reconciling her personal remorse. Ethan listened. He did not accept immediately. He had offers before. He knew the currency of flattery and the slow creep of obligations. He appreciated the offer because it came attached to accountability. He asked for time. He wanted a conversation not about money or prestige, but about integrity and training. He wanted to know whether they were offering a bandage or a commitment. In the weeks that followed, life became a different kind of ordinary. Sophie's drawing found a new home, taped to the inside of the small column in their kitchen, near the wall where notes were pinned. Ethan pinned it himself, because sometimes the smallest rituals mattered more than formal honors. The silver wings sat on a shelf where Sophie could reach them. She made new drawings, their small apartment with a plane above it, the airport with people handing out hugs, the sun with too many rays. People who had been on the plane sent notes. A woman sent a watercolor of a runway. A man whose tie had been loosened handed an envelope with a letter inside saying simply, "You did what you were supposed to do, and that matters. Thank you." The community's small acts of gratitude felt like a net. Isabella invited them both, Ethan and Sophie, to speak at a company safety seminar as a symbol of the change she wanted to enact. It was clumsy at first, a staged apology, a corporate slide deck with bullet points. But something else happened when she asked Ethan to consult. She listened. She listened in the way business people sometimes forget to listen, steadily, without a performance, and with the willingness to recalibrate.
When Ethan agreed to consult, it was not instant glory or money that made him step forward. He was offered compensation, yes, and logistical support for his consulting practice. What mattered more was that she asked with specificity, "Will you review our training protocols? Will you help us understand how to respect crew autonomy and passenger safety equally? Will you help us create a culture where entitlement does not override rule and care?" He said yes because it gave him a chance to shift the conversation from a single humiliation to systemic learning. He said yes because it was a way to translate a painful incident into something useful. He said yes, quietly, with his daughter at his side. The press took the surface story, an entitled CEO meets humbled pilot, and made headlines that treated the unfolding as entertainment. But the small human truth lived elsewhere. It lived in Sophie's drawings pinned to their wall. It lived in the man who had been mocked and who had chosen, under pressure, to be the kind of person who did not need to prove himself by humiliating another. It lived in Isabella's long, awkward apologies that became fewer and more sincere as she learned to ask different questions of herself. In private, Ethan explained his restraint to Sophie in terms a child could carry. Sometimes, he told her, standing tall doesn't mean shouting. Sometimes it means holding your head up so someone who needs you sees how to be calm. She thought about Tat and drew him with a tall stick figure and a very small mouth. She pinned the picture next to the silver wings. Janet kept her job and kept her posture. She had been the rule enforcer who'd walked a fine line between policy and compassion. When the report summarized her as a steward of order, she shrugged. To her, it had been simple work, ensure safety and treat people with a steady hand. She met Ethan at a cafe later and handed him a little note, coffee, and a thank you. He recognized in her the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done the right tiny things that add up. Passengers' accounts after the flight varied, but held a common chord. The moment when the call went out for a fighter pilot changed the room. It disrupted the choreography of social theater. It asked people to reorient toward what mattered. Some felt shame, others relief, but most felt a recalibration of priorities. A man who had joined in the laughter later said, "It was a small thing, but we all saw someone stand up who didn't have to. It made us feel lesser and better at once." Isabella, for her part, changed in manners small and large. She instituted a company policy that would fund sensitivity training and a safety culture program. She initiated a public apology that did not frame itself as performance. She invited the people who had been hurt by entitlement in the company to speak. The shift was imperfect, that is the thing about growth, but it was real.
She called Ethan again months later, this time with less fanfare and more substance. "We've seen changes,"
The board is on board. Would you help guide us?" Ethan met her halfway, literally and figuratively. He sat with her in a bright conference room and told her what she needed to hear, that safety starts with humility, that forgiveness requires accountability, that children learn from what adults do more than from what they say. She listened. She took notes. She made promises that had the feel of work behind them. The world did not become fairer in an instant. Entitlement did not disappear, but the flight became an anecdote people told about the way simple dignity could shape a room. It became a story told in break rooms and by parents at playgrounds. A man who had been mocked rose because someone called for skill, and that skill saved many. The story's edges smoothed in retelling. People added heroism and trimmed hesitation, but the core remained, the quiet choice to act, not to retaliate. In time, a small plaque arrived in the mail addressed to Ethan and Sophie. It was from a group of passengers who had turned their remorse into a fund for community scholarships for single parents who needed help with travel to job interviews. They had pooled money. They had written a note that said simply, "For dignity." Sophie wanted to wear the silver wings like a brooch. She tried it once, and the weight made her giggle. "They're too big," she said. Ethan smiled and put them back on the shelf. He wanted them accessible to her, not because he wanted to aggrandize himself, but because objects sometimes work as maps. They reminded them both where they'd been and where they were allowed to go. On a slow afternoon, a little later, they walked hand in hand into a small sunlit park. Sophie clutched a new sheet of paper. She had drawn the plane again, but this time she had drawn Isabella too, at the back, holding a napkin and crying, a small figure learning to be in the picture rather than erase it. Ethan watched her pin the drawing to a small corkboard they'd made in their kitchen for important things. He thought back to the sound of crystal and laughter, to the metal taste of adrenaline, to the smell of cockpit ozone. He thought about how some lessons arrive wrapped in humiliation and others in gratitude. When a reporter later asked why he had waited, why he had not spoken sooner during the insult, he answered simply, "I didn't want Sophie to see me as someone who needed to take it out on another person to make things right," he said. "She needed to see that dignity can be quiet and that competence doesn't have to be loud." It was the kind of answer that did not fit neatly into newspaper copy. It had no edges of scandal and no sudden rise to celebrity. It was a moral line lived out rather than recited. That mattered to him.
Isabella, who had once moved in a world where social currency was worn like jewelry, learned to understand the cost of assuming lesser value in others. Her apology changed the way she treated people in elevators and meeting rooms. She instituted small daily rituals in her company, a moment at the beginning of major meetings to remind leaders to check assumptions. It was not a fix-all, it never could be, but it nudged a culture. There were small human moments that did not register in the headlines. The businessman from 3A bought Sophie a new pack of crayons at the airport kiosk. A woman who had been laughing earlier took a minute to teach Sophie how to fold a paper plane that actually glided. Janet, off-duty, took a picture of Sophie with her drawing pinned to the kitchen board and sent it to Ethan with a thumbs-up emoji. These were the stitches that mended the edges of a day that could easily have been only a scar. Ethan kept his dignity because he had reasons beyond a public image. He kept it because he wanted his daughter to know what restraint looked like. He wanted to show her that the world is often unkind, but that your reaction could be a lesson for someone who trusted you to teach it. In the quiet that followed, many people reflected on their own small cruelties and their own opportunities to be better. The story became less about spectacle and more about a simple choice. In moments when power tempts, will you wield it to wound or to protect? In moments when skill arrives unexpectedly, will you turn it into a spectacle or use it as service? On a gray morning months later, the three of them, Ethan, Sophie, and, in a far gentle arc, Isabella, stood at a community event to speak about safety and respect. The crowd was small, but earnest. Isabella had arranged it, not as a show, but as a practical commitment. Ethan spoke about checklists and calm hands. Isabella spoke about humility and about learning to make decisions that honored people rather than just profit. Sophie drew suns on place cards. At the close, Sophie handed Isabella a new drawing, a sunny airport with people holding hands, 2 small stick figures in the middle, smiling. Isabella accepted it with a look that said she had been given something she had not expected to care about, an offering, small and fierce, that could reshape her daily choices. They walked away together, not as a neat symbol, but as a collection of people who had been altered by an ordinary, messy human event. Back at home, Sophie pinned the drawing next to the silver wings. Ethan kissed her forehead and said, "We fly our own way." She nodded, satisfied with that, and went to the window to watch a plane cross the sky. If you were moved by how dignity met skill on that flight, consider this a small invitation to keep watching stories like this.
If you want to see more moments where ordinary people become the kind of person others need, hit subscribe and stay with us.
The plane had not been a cathedral, the people not saints, and the apology not a cure. But the event had become a lesson in the currency of human decency. Where entitlement had once offered itself as a shortcut to self-importance, competence had returned a longer truth, steady, useful, and generous. Where humiliation had once shown how quick a room could be to judge, the crisis revealed how quickly a room could correct itself when given a reason. Ethan did not become a public figure overnight. He returned to consulting and to pancake mornings, and once or twice he flew for training missions to keep his skills sharp. Isabella continued to lead, now a little less sure, but a little more watchful. Janet continued to tend to people and pages and the small chorus of human needs that make travel possible. Sophie continued to draw suns with too many rays, and sometimes, in the evening, she would add a little pilot with a tiny silver wing in the corner of a picture. Months later, as they walked through the terminal to board a different flight, a woman at the gate glanced over and nodded at Ethan as if they shared a secret. Sophie smiled and climbed into his hand. He tightened his grip briefly, just enough so she knew she was held, and that the world, no matter how loud or careless, could still be a place where dignity was worth keeping. If this story reminded you of a time someone's dignity surprised you, share it with them. And if you'd like to hear more stories where quiet courage changes outcomes, subscribe and join us for the next one.